got a lot of events going on this week here at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in celebration of Indian Market. And we start off with our breakfast with the curators on Tuesday. And we have Bruce Bernstein, who is the executive director of the Southwest Indian Arts Association. And he is, of course, you know, he's the mastermind behind Indian Market and all the people that work for him. So he'll be here. He's going to tell us some of the highlights of things that are going to be going on this year for Indian Market. And then on Friday, Charles will be back to do a breakfast with the curators. And for that one, he's going to do a personal tour through the exhibit. So I hope you'll be able to come back and really get that bird's eye curatorial perspective of the Tony Day exhibit, because Charles is really, he's the expert. And I have to say the exhibit would not have happened if it hadn't been for Charles and of course Richard Spivey. I got a call, a little over 2 years ago from Richard, who I worked with Richard as a curator at 2 different institutions when he was writing his second book on Maria Martinez. And Richard called me just out of the blue and he said, "Shelby, Charles King and I are writing a book about Tony Day. And MIAC has to do an exhibit on Tony Day." And I said, "When?" And he said, "Well, it has to be opened by Indian Market of 2011. And I went, "Cool. That's almost, you know, not quite 2 years from now." And I said, "That's going to be tough. But we'll look at our schedule." I rearranged some of the exhibits we had on our schedule. I said, "This we have to do." And so Charles and Richard and I got together in Tucson that year at Thanksgiving, and we just kind of brainstormed and looked at, you know, the possibilities when we could get the exhibit open, how we were going to do it, and we started pulling it together. And then at Indian Market last year, Charles and Richard gave me photographs to start working with in terms of arranging the exhibition. And also, we started putting some names together of who owned a lot of these pieces. And then things started happening very, very quickly. And I can't go forward today without thanking the 28 lenders who let us borrow pieces for this exhibit. I know it was very difficult for you to let those pieces go for especially almost a year, or actually over a year. So many of you are in the audience. I just want to thank you all so much for letting us borrow your pieces. I also want to thank all the individuals who provided the financial support to put this exhibit on. This was a little more complicated because we had to borrow so many pieces from across the country. And there were, of course, expenses involved in that. But also, with the kind of exhibit I wanted to do, I really wanted to pull out the stops. Because I thought Tony Day is one individual, one artist who really deserves to have a professional exhibition done. And I think we did a good job of it. I really do. I think this is probably one of the best exhibits this museum has ever done. And every day I walk through that gallery, I feel blessed to be here. I feel blessed to be surrounded by such incredible beauty. And Tony Day's work speaks of so much beauty and so much care and so much, I think, just an authenticity that speaks of Southwest Indian art. So I appreciate all that you have, many of you in the audience have done to help this exhibit come together. Today, we're launching the book, and it's here. This is just one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen. They just arrived on Friday, and this is literally, we're launching the book here today. And I want to just introduce somebody very quickly before I bring Charles up. Jared Day, who is Tony's son, who's also an incredible painter, is here with us today. Thank you so much for coming today, Jared. the lecture today, we're going to have a book signing, which will be right by the gift shop. And Jared has been, he's also going to be signing books with Charles. So I think this is a special opportunity for those of you who have books. So I want to introduce Charles King. Charles has King Galleries in Scottsdale, on Main Street in Scottsdale, phenomenal gallery. Does a lot of work with contemporary artists, but also with some of the masters who are no longer with us. And Charles has really been the, I think, the driving force behind the exhibit. He let me look at a draft of the manuscript while it was still in draft form. And as a writer, you know, that draft form you really don't want to give to anybody. But he was more than gracious and let us borrow the draft manuscript, and we were able to develop a lot of our text and our label copy from that. And I really appreciate that, Charles. Thanks so much. Charles King, everybody.
Thank Shelby to begin with for the museum put on a really spectacular exhibit. The way it's all come together is really pretty amazing. And as well, thanks to everybody who loaned the pieces, everybody who went into their house to photograph pieces, arriving what I should have or should not have, and Bill Faust as well for helping me take a lot of the photos. So it all came together pretty well. I also want to take just a moment before I get started and just say a few words about Richard Spivey. That, as many of you probably know, Richard passed away about a month and a half ago. And the book really would not have been possible without him. That his connection with the family, his knowledge of San Ildefonso pottery, about his friendship with Pueblo, with Maria, with his knowledge, it just really would not have come together. So, although as he said, when we started the project, he said, the one thing is, he said, I'll be glad to help you, but you get to do all the work. And I think that actually turned out about right. The upside, though, is that Richard had a chance to see the digital form of the cover and the book in digital form, and he was really quite pleased. So I think he would have been very proud of the final result, and he certainly gave a lot of information. And I want to thank Jared as well, because his interviews and his knowledge and his putting up with my incessant questions and emails was very, very nice and very helpful. So before I get started, I also want to have a few additional remarks about Pueblo. So Tony's father was Pueblo, and he really started some of the innovations that Tony really perfected. So things like the gunmetal, the black and sienna firings, the sgraffito, and putting stones in the pottery, all really kind of began with Pueblo, and in a sense, at times they were covering up mistakes or very small, intricate parts of what he was doing. And Tony really took those and expounded upon them. So I just want to make sure that Poe gets his due, as they say, and I'm not neglectful of that. And I also want you to consider that as we go through the talk here today, and we're going to cover sort of three aspects of the work: the pottery, the paintings, and also Tony himself. But consider that there really was only about 15 years of work that he did, from about 1967 to 1982. And in such a brief period of time that someone could produce such an amazing output of artwork is really pretty spectacular. The presentation that I put together for this I call Icon and Iconography, and I suppose the other word I could have added is iconoclast, because in a certain way Tony broke all the rules that today they don't seem quite so challenging, but at the time people were a little bit shocked at some of the things that he did. So, I'm going to get this together right. So, we'll start at the beginning. That on April 1st, 1940, Tony Day was born, and the grandson of Julio Martinez and Marie Martinez. And at that period of time, Julio and Maria were already very well known as potters. His parents were Anita Day and Pueblo Day. And he really wasn't raised in a to become an artist. His parents really had this idea that somehow he'd end up going into business. And so in 1959, he went to Western New Mexico University. And there he was supposed to study business. But instead, he became inspired by the Min-raised pottery, which was found in that area. And it became sort of a lifelong obsession for him, something which fascinated him for the rest of his life. This is one of his paintings from 1959. And you can see it's sort of that first chance of looking at some of the, not just San Alfonso iconography like the water serpent, but imagery that he took from the Min-raised pottery. After he was in university, he managed that for 1 year and then went into the Navy. And after he was out of the Navy, in 1966, he moved in with Marie Martinez when one of her sons died. And in 1967, there's a picture here, and it's from the 3 Generations show that was in Washington, D.C. And Tony attended that. He brought his team. And in 1966 and 67, he created some, probably his most intricate and complicated paintings of his entire career. They were all abstract, but they really involved a lot of different symbols and designs that you can see later on in his work. In this particular painting, just a couple of things to point out that are kind of interesting. In the lower left, there's a plate with the lizards on it. And if you remember, notice out in the exhibits, and we'll look at it later, actually did a piece in clay that's identical to that. You see the bear down here on the center of this jar. Again, imagery that he would use later. The turtles and the frogs. And all these, and beginning sort of the layering and the abstract nature of his work. But while he was living with Maria, so in 1967, he started doing his very first pieces of pottery. And up until that point, he really had done nothing at all with the clay. This is one of his very first pieces, which is a very simple, small bowl with an incised bear paw. And one of the things that Tony said about his work was that it was not really a conscious effort to master the medium, but an accidental occurrence. And in that sense, it was because he moved in with Maria, and I think going to the 3 Generations show, that he had the sense that there was really a future for him in working in the clay. And it's amazing to think that within his first year of working in pottery, he expanded from simple pieces like that to larger, more complex pieces like this. His learning curve of working with Maria was really pretty extraordinary. It's also a good point to realize that when he first started doing pottery, he was really one of the very first male potters. Up until that point, men would design pottery, but it was really something that women made pottery. So he's really considered sort of the very first male potter and designer. And as I talked about, the Min-raised imagery is something that he was really one of the first to start incorporating into the pottery. And the plate on the left, he actually took designs that were seen from in actual Min-raised pottery and incorporated it onto his work. But then afterwards, he started to create some of his own designs, like the buffalo and the deer and the antelope that you'll see on these pieces. And a couple things to notice that are kind of interesting about these pieces. If you look at the buffalo, and you can see his feet, and everybody always thinks they're kind of funny because they're sort of U-shaped. But what they really are is they're the buffalo hoof prints, and the buffalo sort of extends backwards from that. And he does the same with the deer and the antelope in these pieces. And really, they become almost these sort of shadow animals, projected backwards from their tracks. Something else to also notice, if you take a closer look as you walk through the exhibit at the black plate that's out there, when Tony first started doing his graffito work, which is the etching into the surface of the clay, his very first pieces he did after they were fired. And Tony was very much a perfectionist. And what would happen is, you would end up with this crackling and along the edges of where he had incised into the clay. And visually, he really hated that. And so he started doing the incising before the pieces were fired. So you ended up with these very clean lines. So as you look at most of the pieces, when you look at that edge line between the polished surface and the cutaway area, you see these very clean lines. So when we look at his blackware, all of the pieces that are fired to a gunmetal firing, he did with Papo Vide with his father. and started out doing just the simple blackware pieces, and then pretty soon started doing the black and sienna. And the black and sienna, there are a few early pieces that they may have double fired, but really in the end, they started using the blowtorch pretty early on, and that created the sienna coloration. So the pieces would be fired, and they would come out a gunmetal coloration like this. And then you would use a blowtorch to create the sienna and burn away the gunmetal area. One of the things that he did on his pieces, and consistently, is that you can see this sort of rainbow ridge of black. So it goes sienna, that sort of rainbow ridge of black, and then the gunmetal. And all of his black and sienna pieces have that. And it was something that he purposefully tried to create on the black and sienna ware. After Pueblo died, Tony did one gunmetal firing, and then he did a few throughout the 1970s of black firings. And what happened when he did the black firings is you ended up with pieces that looked more like this, and he still tried to create that halo effect around the sienna areas. But because the pieces had fired such a dark black, it really didn't come across in the same type of stark visual contrast as you see on the earlier pieces. So in addition to the black and sienna, he obviously started to add stones into his work. One of the things that you'll notice with the use of the stones is that the areas where they were placed, a lot of times the area was carved deeply into the clay so that when the stone was put in, it was actually flush with the surface. The areas for the stones are also almost are right up to the edge of the stone itself. So the clay and the stone are really perfectly matched. When he first started with pottery, one of the things that he really worked on was the form. Like on this jar, the texture. So around the center is an area that's not only sienna, but it's matte. And also the firing techniques. And I get a new microphone. Okay. So in taking those forms and first starting out with things like the texture and the firing, he began to add more material to it, adding the heat sheet. With those pieces, just like he did with the stones, they were carved into the clay. The area was carved into the clay first, and then after the firing, the stones and the heat sheet would be added. And then the pieces began to evolve from there. So you ended up with much more complicated design patterns on the pieces, and more complicated carving in pieces like with the lids. The lids are kind of one of those classic parts of Tony's pottery. They started out simple, like the one in the upper corner, just simple handles. And they became these incredibly intricate videos where he would carve them, often using a Dremel tool to create very subtle layers of carving. And doing things in clay that really nobody had been able to achieve before. There are also several of his pieces that have silver lids. This is the very first one that he did that has a silver lid to it. It could be that I think on this one he may have very well made the lid. It's from 1972. This is a later one from 1977. And it could be that he had somebody else make it. So Tony was willing to allow other people to do things like make the lids. But it was really more about the final result of the pieces, the aesthetic effect that he was trying to create. The bears as a form are probably one of the most identifiable aspects of his work. Now in the upper corner you can see the black bear in the center is one of his early bears. And they started out these very sort of long, elongated forms. They quickly evolved into the red bear behind it, where they became more stylized, with that sharp curve connecting the legs. All of the bears were actually built as bowls, so they started upside down, and then he would turn them over. As time went along, the bears became more and more intricate and more sculptural. So near the end of his career, he was doing pieces like the larger bear here, which were definitely more sculptural, carving into different layers. And of course, the turtles are probably one of the most iconic aspects of his work. The turtles are interesting in the sense that, again, they started out as bowls, so they'd be upside down. That's how he would begin to make it. When he first started did his first bowl, or his first turtle in 1969, and the first one with a removable lid in 1971. A lot of the turtles also, he would create silver pieces that would set inside them. So when he would turn it over after he made it, he would cut off that top section and add the bear to it. And the next on the turtles were also always separate pieces. Over time, the turtles became more and more elaborate. The one up on the top corner now is one that he made for Santa Fe Indian Market in 1974. And again, notice when you take a look at that piece, how tightly the polished edge meets the stone, the various number of strands of pea sheet that is used, and the sculptural aspect of the lizard on top, which again, using native clay, is pretty extraordinary what he's able to achieve. In looking at things like the turtles, however, it's kind of interesting to think back that today we look at them and they're this very iconic and sort of established form. This is one of the very first turtles that he entered in a competitive show, and what they wrote about it was, the most spectacular work in the show, the lidded ceramic turtle vessel by Tony Day, San Ildefonso, is also the most controversial, in an otherwise conservative exhibition. To the purist, this is a shocking piece that brazenly defies the limitations of the medium. Today we look at it and think it's simply beautiful, and in 1971 people were shocked and kind of stunned that with the adding the stones, it was creating that shape that was sort of out of the norm and beyond expectation. In terms of additional forms, again with the animals, Tony created 2 owls. And one of them is up at the Mills of Rogers Museum, and that is the other one. And then by the late 1970s, for a lot of his pieces, Tony had his Aunt Clara and his sister do the polishing. And at that point, she was getting older and not able to polish as much, and sort of taking a benefit out of adversity, Tony began to make pieces that were all matte surfaces. And instead of just leaving just a plain matte, he would buff the surface so that and rake polish it so that it had the look and feel of leather. And then he began to experiment with something really quite extraordinary, and something that I think even to this day we don't have any other potters creating the same effect. And it's this cameo relief style of carving. So as opposed to just doing this graffito work, you could end up with these rounded out images carved into the clay. And it was sort of the last thing he was experimenting with. And it was also at this point in his career, around 1980, that you end up with pieces like this, where just like his paintings, we'll talk about them in a few minutes, there's layering. You end up with this layering in his pottery. Here you have in a carved area in the pot, the flute player, with just layered on top of a sgraffito ram. It's sort of multiple layers, this connection that seems to be coming out of his work of the pottery and also of the paintings. Working in this matte style also allowed him to create pieces that were much more sculptural. Looking at something like this bear where you have the turquoise inset into the back of it, and they're actually floating, connected, just held in place by the pieces of clay on either side. So now we'll talk a little bit about some of his paintings. Tony was influenced by Joe Carrara, who was a well-known abstract painter from Pueblo. This is one of Tony's early paintings from 1964, and one that was used quite a bit for the imagery for this exhibit. And it's interesting because this is one of the first known examples of using these sort of concentric overlapping circles with this either Kachina mask or Navajo design, something that, again, has been used over and over again. And this was sort of one of the very first times we see one of the Pueblo artists, using that kind of imagery. With all of Tony's paintings, they were all painted with cassine. So it's a milk-based watercolor. It let him, he would mix his own colors, and that was one of the things that was really quite extraordinary with his pieces is there's a lot to do with color and a lot to do with layering. Here you see him painting one of his paintings from 1967. And this painting is one of his first major award-winning paintings, Spring Blessing. And here you can see this incredibly intricate and complicated nature to the painting. Beginning with some of the ideas of, again, of the overlaying and overlapping of colors, the various textures. And again, a lot of the iconography, Mimbre's designs like the frogs and different animals that you'll see later in more and more of his work. As I mentioned earlier, there's this series of paintings that he did in 1966 through 1968. They were very intricate. And after that, they began to become more abstract. He began to pull apart a lot of the imagery, making it more isolated. He began to focus on color and on layering aspects of his work. He began to add more detail and geometric shapes to the backgrounds of his pieces. And finally creating these paintings through 1975, where you see, it's almost like looking through time or looking through a window, where you have all these different layers, these different views of things overlapping and interconnecting. From 1973 to 1975, he stopped painting, or painted very little. And after he moved to Colorado, he began painting again. The paintings that he started at this point in time tended to become more complicated, again focusing on layering techniques, but more intricate than his previous work. In 1977, he started to add turquoise into a lot of his paintings. Again, this sort of ebb and flow, this connection back and forth between the pottery and the paintings. In 1978 or 77, he started to do his first acrylic paintings. And the acrylics were a little bit more difficult from the standpoint that, in terms of doing the layering techniques, he really wasn't able to mix the colors and create that translucent effect that he could with the cassine. And yet he ended up with these minimalist, really pretty extraordinary pieces. This painting here, which is out in the exhibit, I think ends up being one of the most visually striking of his works, taking very simple plant designs and seed patterns from San Alfonso, creating a very simplistic use of color and creating this really extraordinary painting. If everybody can hear me, I'm glad to continue to go on. Or, we'll see. Microphone number 3. Third time's a charm. So in 1978, he created his very first casting. So this is the original play piece. And he created a series of 25 bronzes and 25 pieces in silver. And before his accident, of the bronzes, there were 23 that were cast, and of the silver pieces, there were 16. And in 2000, Richard Spivey was interviewing Anita Day and realized that the edition was not done. It was too short on the bronzes, so they finished casting out the last 2 of the bronzes. Silver pieces, there's only 16 of them. But one of the things that's really fascinating about these is that every one of the bronzes is different, with a different patina to it. So he wanted them to all still look like an original, each one to be a little bit different from the next. And he did the same with the silver pieces. So even they were a little bit different. And one of the things that I had, this is kind of, I guess, sort of an amusing story, that tried to find out a little bit more about the history of the bronzes. And I had a painting that belonged to Bill Faust that had a title on it and writing, and Tony had given it to Bill, and I couldn't figure out, I kept trying to find the name of an exhibit or an exhibition of where this painting had come from. And the painting was titled Pueblo. And I was flipping through, going through all the magazines from the 1970s, American Indian Arts, and all the different ones, and I came across an ad that looked identical to this. And all of a sudden it all came together. We actually had the original painting in our hands, and the title for all of the bronzes. And it was an ad that Tony had put together, and he had painted the painting just for the ad. This is Tony at his very first Gallup ceremonials. At that time, while Indian Market is the big thing today, Gallup ceremonials was the big show back in the late 1960s. So that's his very first exhibit. And you can see some of the variety of things that he did for that. The Hono ovens, the bear, the little peace pipe that's down there. But Tony really understood that in selling his work, he was also selling himself. Up in the corner, you can also see a picture of him with Maria Martinez and the 3-generation pot, which is on exhibit here. And here he is with his wife, Lou, and he was definitely a showman. His wife was always very fashionable in her dress. There's a great story about one of her squash blossom necklaces where he took the stones out to use in one of his pots. He really understood the sense of wanting to create this idea of the modern Indian. Of course, there's the famous photo down here on the bottom. He had the buckskin suit, which was made for him by a Hollywood set designer. And so he was really willing, while he was a very private person, he was also really willing to promote himself and understand his place in the art world. He would always say, or he had a saying that the more outrageous you are, the more people will come to see you. And that was definitely true at a lot of shows. Up in the corner is, I think, a really wonderful photo of him with Maria. In the center is him and Lavina Ole, and on the right is Ellis Taylor. By the late 1970s, he's working primarily with galleries, just Tanner's and Lavina Ole Gallery. So thinking about Tony Day, I think it's a name that really becomes synonymous with quality, with perfection, with innovation, with creativity, and also with showmanship. In a way, he was really a quiet revolutionary in the world of native art. If you consider that he was the first male potter, he was the first to add stones, add hishi, do black and sienna, and make them all intricate parts of his design work. His inspiration of Mimbray's pottery really became the first to use it on contemporary work. In his paintings, he really brought a new direction in terms of the layering techniques and the simplicity of direction that he was going. He created innovations in his artwork that are so commonplace that today we barely think about where they originated. He really began that transition from folk art to fine art. He's certainly a person that you can see from the photo here, definitely a showman, and definitely changed the landscape of Pueblo pottery and Native American art. So that's my presentation on Tony. Hopefully that'll give you a little bit better sense of some of the pieces that you see out there. I encourage everybody, I hope you get a chance to check out the book, and I encourage you to, well, I'll have some this week, and be doing a book signing as well with Andre Fisher on Friday. So certainly acquire a book here at the museum. Helping out the gift shop adds funds to them, and all museums are always in need of more funds. And so everybody's been very generous, and this is certainly a great spot to acquire the book. And you will be the very first. This is the place in town they are until about Tuesday or Wednesday. So if anybody has any particular questions, please feel free to ask.
These stones, how are those inserted and secured?
The stones were all glued into the clay. So when the piece, before it was fired, you would actually carve out He would hold, put the stone up against it, carve against it, and then place the stone into it after it was fired.
On that particular piece, why is the top darker than
What? This is a later one of his pieces from around 1980 or 81. So the lid is actually all matte, so it's not a polished surface. The bowl itself is actually black fired as opposed to gunmetal fired. So you can see how he tried to create that halo effect here. And on those black pieces, it just didn't have that same visual contrast that it did on the gunmetal. On a lot of later pieces, he would use the matte for a lid, even though the vessel itself was polished. So just trying various different visual techniques to sort of move your eye around on the pieces. And something like the lid, creating that sort of floating stone in the center of the lid, became these things were amazingly complicated, amazing that they survived any type of firing, and sort of creating that contrast in the lids and in the design work.
Was he the first to use the blowtorch?
Yeah, there was a...
Sienna?
Richard gave me the opportunity to look over the notes that when he interviewed Anita Day. And so Anita, he asked her about whether they did, a two-firing process or whether they used the blowtorch. She said they tried the dual firing, and it was so complicated. She said after that, they just realized using the blowtorch was just a much simpler way to do it. And it also allowed him to really create some of those fine, if you look at sort of how that halo effect is, it's even all the way around. He really was very much a perfectionist in all of his work. And trying to double fire them, you'd end up with a very blotchy sort of appearance, and aesthetically not very appealing. So using the blowtorch, you're really able to control exactly the area that you want it to be sienna, how you wanted that to look.
Considering how contemporary he was it still judged at Indian market? In the beginning?
I think at the very beginning, he had a problem getting things into Indian market. There was really sort of a concern about what it is that, the sgraffito work really didn't start until him. So doing that kind of surface work, adding the stones, really held a lot of resistance at Santa Fe Indian market. On the other hand, some place like Gallup Ceremonials, his very first year entering, they created whole new awards for him because the work was so outstanding. So it really speaks to the kind of how people reacted to his work in different areas. But certainly that idea that even in 1971, they're writing about the turtles and people are still shocked by them. And, I would say it's sort of still the era of Maria Martinez. That's the standard that everybody is judging the pottery by in the early 1970s. And his has gone so far beyond that. And maybe in a way he was, the luck is that he was Maria's grandson. And so he was able to do things that nobody else would have ever been able to get away with. Well, thank you again, and I appreciate everybody for coming. They were considerably less than so it's amazing. It's just probably by around 1980s.
Thank you, Jared.
Sure, thank you.
It's been great. We've also, Royal was up here.
Yeah, she said it was like so overwhelming.
It was. We had 300 people. Yeah, we can. When you were here for the
I've actually talked to another Indian market.
Oh, okay.
Did you get some music? Showman. Went down there for years. Of course, she's actually doing it. That's a wonderful talk.